They laughed at his underground operation, until Frank Lucas became Harlem's most wanted. From rural poverty to urban ambition. The year was 1961 when Frank Lucas first arrived in Harlem with nothing but the clothes on his back and a burning desire to escape the suffocating poverty of rural North Carolina. Born in La Grange, North Carolina, in 1938, Frank had witnessed firsthand the brutal realities of segregation and economic desperation that defined the American South during the mid-20th century. His childhood was marked by hardship. His family struggled to make ends meet, and the opportunities available to young black men in the rural South were virtually non-existent. The cotton fields and tobacco plantations that dominated the landscape offered only backbreaking labor and minimal wages, a future that Frank Lucas refused to accept. When Frank was just 15 years old, a traumatic incident would change the trajectory of his life forever. He witnessed the kidnapping and murder of his 12-year-old cousin by members of the Ku Klux Klan. The perpetrators were never brought to justice, a stark reminder of the lawlessness and racial violence that permeated the South. This event crystallized something within Frank, a conviction that the legitimate system would never protect him or his family, and that survival in America required operating outside the boundaries of conventional morality. It was a lesson that would define his entire existence. By the time Frank Lucas reached his late teens, he had already begun to establish himself as a small-time hustler in North Carolina. He ran numbers, engaged in petty theft, and gradually built a reputation as someone who was willing to take risks that others would not. But North Carolina was too small for his ambitions. The real money, the real power, the real opportunity, all of it existed in the North, in the sprawling urban centers where fortunes could be made and lost in a single night. Harlem, New York, represented everything that Frank Lucas dreamed of: anonymity, opportunity, and the chance to build an empire. When he arrived in Harlem in the early 1960s, Frank Lucas was just another young black man trying to find his way in a city that was simultaneously welcoming and ruthless. He took legitimate jobs initially, working as a driver and in other service positions, but his eyes were always scanning for the real opportunities. Harlem in the 1960s was a powder keg of social tension, economic inequality, and drug addiction. The heroin epidemic was beginning to take hold of the community, and the profits to be made in the drug trade were astronomical. Frank Lucas recognized this immediately, and he began to position himself within the existing drug networks, learning the business from the ground up. If you're fascinated by stories of ambition, survival, and the darker side of the American dream, subscribe to our channel for more compelling narratives about figures who shaped urban history. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of history enthusiasts. By the mid-1960s, Frank Lucas had become a significant figure in Harlem's drug trade, but he was still operating in the shadow of more established dealers. The real turning point came when he began to think differently about the business. While other dealers were content to work as middlemen, buying heroin from established suppliers and selling it on the streets, Frank Lucas envisioned something far more ambitious. He wanted to control the entire supply chain, from production to distribution. This vision led him to establish connections with suppliers in Southeast Asia, particularly in Thailand and Vietnam. During the Vietnam War, American soldiers were returning home with heroin addictions, and the drug was flowing into American cities in unprecedented quantities. Frank Lucas realized that he could bypass the traditional Italian and Jewish suppliers who had dominated the heroin trade in New York for decades. He could go directly to the source, establish his own supply lines, and undercut the competition on price while maintaining superior quality. It was a business strategy that was both brilliant and ruthless. Frank's operation became known for its efficiency and innovation. He established a strict code of conduct for his organization: no violence unless absolutely necessary, no dealing with police informants, and no tolerance for theft or disloyalty. In an industry defined by chaos and brutality, Frank's organizational structure was almost corporate in its sophistication. He employed hundreds of people, from street-level dealers to accountants who managed his finances. He established a hierarchy, clear lines of authority, and consequences for those who violated the rules. The money that flowed into Frank Lucas's organization was staggering. At the height of his operation in the early 1970s, he was earning an estimated $1 million per day. He invested this money in real estate, legitimate businesses, and a lavish lifestyle that made him a celebrity in Harlem. He wore custom-made suits, drove expensive cars, and lived in a mansion in New Jersey. He became a patron of the community, sponsoring youth programs and donating to local causes. To many in Harlem, Frank Lucas was not a criminal. He was a success story, a man who had risen from nothing to become powerful and wealthy. But Frank's success did not go unnoticed by law enforcement. The DEA, the FBI, and the NYPD were all aware of his operation, and they were determined to bring him down. The challenge was that Frank had insulated himself from direct involvement in street-level dealing. He operated through layers of intermediaries, making it difficult to connect him directly to the drug trade. Moreover, his organization was remarkably disciplined. There were few informants, and those who might have considered betraying him knew that the consequences would be severe. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of Harlem's most notorious figures, please like this video. Your support helps us continue to produce high-quality content about the untold stories of American history. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, Frank Lucas operated with an almost supernatural sense of invincibility. He had built an organization that seemed impervious to law enforcement, and he had cultivated a public image that transcended his criminal activities. In Harlem, he was celebrated as a folk hero, a man who had beaten the system and achieved success on his own terms. Young people in the neighborhood idolized him, and even those who were not directly involved in his operation benefited from the economic activity that his presence generated. Frank's confidence grew with each passing year. He began to take greater risks, to flaunt his wealth more openly, and to involve himself more directly in the operations of his organization. He attended high-profile events, was seen in exclusive nightclubs, and became a fixture in Harlem's social scene. He even began to consider himself above the law, believing that his connections, his money, and his organization were sufficient to protect him from any threat. This period of invincibility was built on a foundation of careful planning and ruthless execution. Frank had established a supply chain that was virtually unbreakable. He had connections in Vietnam and Thailand that provided him with pure heroin at a fraction of the cost that other dealers were paying. He had a distribution network that was so efficient that his product could reach the streets of Harlem within days of arriving in the country. He had a financial system that allowed him to launder his money through legitimate businesses and investments. And he had a security apparatus that was designed to protect him from both law enforcement and rival dealers. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect operation, there were cracks beginning to form. Frank's organization was so large and so profitable that it had attracted the attention of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the country. The DEA had assigned a task force specifically to investigate Frank Lucas, and they were determined to build a case that would stick. They began to conduct extensive surveillance, to flip informants, and to gather evidence that would eventually lead to his downfall. Additionally, Frank's success had made him enemies. Other drug dealers in Harlem and throughout New York City resented his dominance and his ability to undercut their prices. Some of them began to plot against him, to attempt to infiltrate his organization, and to gather intelligence that could be used against him. The criminal underworld, like any other world, was governed by competition and jealousy, and Frank's prominence made him a target. Frank's personal life also began to show signs of strain. His relationships with family members became complicated by his criminal activities and his wealth. Some family members wanted to benefit from his success, while others were troubled by the moral implications of his business. His romantic relationships were often turbulent, marked by jealousy and the complications that arose from his lifestyle. And despite his outward confidence, Frank was beginning to experience the psychological toll of living a double life, presenting himself as a legitimate businessman while secretly running one of the largest drug operations in the country. What are your thoughts on Frank Lucas's rise to power? Do you think he was a product of his circumstances, or do you believe he made conscious choices that led to his criminal empire? Share your perspectives in the comments below. We'd love to hear your analysis of this complex historical figure. The beginning of the end came in the early 1970s when law enforcement intensified its efforts to dismantle Frank Lucas's organization. The DEA, working in coordination with the NYPD, launched Operation Harlem Kingpin, a massive investigation designed specifically to target Frank Lucas and his associates. The operation involved hundreds of agents and officers, and it employed sophisticated surveillance techniques, wiretapping, and informant networks. One of the most significant developments in the investigation was the recruitment of informants from within Frank's own organization. Despite his careful vetting and his harsh punishments for disloyalty, there were individuals within his network who were willing to cooperate with law enforcement in exchange for reduced sentences or immunity. These informants provided crucial information about the structure of Frank's organization, the locations of his operations, and the identities of his key associates. In January 1975, federal agents raided Frank Lucas's home in New Jersey, seizing large quantities of drugs, cash, and weapons. The raid was a shock to Frank, who had believed himself to be untouchable. But worse was to come. Over the following months, federal agents arrested dozens of Frank's associates, dismantling the organization piece by piece. The pressure mounted, and the walls began to close in. Frank Lucas's response to this pressure would ultimately seal his fate. Facing the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence and the collapse of his empire, Frank made a decision that would have profound consequences. He agreed to cooperate with law enforcement. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Frank provided detailed information about his drug operation, his suppliers, his distribution networks, and his associates. He testified against numerous individuals, including some of his closest collaborators. This decision to cooperate with the authorities was controversial and remains so to this day. Some viewed it as a pragmatic choice, Frank recognizing that his empire was finished and attempting to minimize the damage to himself. Others saw it as a betrayal of the code of silence that governed the criminal underworld. Regardless of one's perspective, Frank's cooperation was instrumental in the prosecution of numerous drug dealers and in the dismantling of one of the largest drug operations in American history. Frank Lucas was convicted of drug trafficking and sentenced to 70 years in prison. However, due to his cooperation with the authorities, his sentence was eventually reduced. He served approximately 15 years in federal prison before being released. The man who had once been the king of Harlem, who had earned millions of dollars and lived a life of luxury, now found himself stripped of his freedom, his wealth, and his power. The story of Frank Lucas is a powerful reminder of the consequences of criminal activity and the complexity of the American criminal justice system. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel to stay updated on more fascinating historical narratives and true crime stories that challenge our understanding of American society. Frank Lucas was released from prison in 1981, and he spent the remainder of his life attempting to rebuild himself and to distance himself from his criminal past. He became a consultant for law enforcement agencies, providing insights into drug trafficking operations and organized crime. He also became something of a celebrity, with his story being adapted into films and television documentaries. In 2007, the film American Gangster, starring Denzel Washington, brought Frank Lucas's story to a wider audience, cementing his place in popular culture as one of the most notorious drug dealers in American history. But the real Frank Lucas was far more complex than the Hollywood version. He was a man who had been shaped by poverty, racism, and the limited opportunities available to young black men in mid-20th century America. He was also a man who had made conscious choices to engage in criminal activity, choices that had profound consequences not only for himself, but for the thousands of people whose lives were destroyed by heroin addiction. The story of Frank Lucas is not simply a tale of crime and punishment. It is a reflection on the structural inequalities that create the conditions for such criminal enterprises to flourish. In his later years, Frank Lucas became something of a philosopher, reflecting on his life and the choices he had made. He acknowledged the harm that his drug operation had caused to the community of Harlem, and he expressed regret for the lives that had been destroyed by addiction. He also spoke about the systemic racism and economic inequality that had shaped his early life and that had made the drug trade seem like the only viable path to success. His reflections suggest a man who had come to understand the moral dimensions of his actions, even if that understanding came only after decades of imprisonment and exile from society. Frank Lucas died on May 30, 2019, at the age of 80. His death marked the end of an era in Harlem's history, an era defined by the rise and fall of one of the most powerful drug dealers in American history. But his legacy extends far beyond the criminal underworld. His story has become a lens through which we can examine the broader issues of poverty, racism, opportunity, and the choices that individuals make when confronted with limited options. The story of Frank Lucas raises profound questions about the nature of crime, punishment, and redemption in America. It challenges us to consider the structural factors that create the conditions for criminal enterprises to flourish. It asks us to reflect on the consequences of the drug war and the mass incarceration that has characterized American criminal justice policy for the past several decades. And it invites us to consider the possibility of redemption and transformation, even for those who have committed serious crimes. The people who laughed at Frank Lucas's underground operation in the early days of his career were proven wrong. His operation was not a joke. It was a sophisticated, well-organized enterprise that generated millions of dollars and shaped the history of Harlem. But the ultimate lesson of Frank Lucas's story is not one of triumph or vindication. Rather, it is a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing wealth and power through criminal means, and about the ultimate futility of believing oneself to be above the law. In the end, Frank Lucas's empire crumbled, his freedom was taken away, and he was forced to confront the consequences of his choices. His story serves as a powerful reminder that no one is truly untouchable, and that the pursuit of illegal wealth, no matter how successful it may appear in the moment, inevitably leads to destruction. Frank Lucas's story is a testament to the complexity of American history and the human capacity for both ambition and redemption. If this narrative has resonated with you, please like this video and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Frank Lucas's legacy. What do you think his story teaches us about crime, punishment, and the American dream? Subscribe to our channel for more in-depth explorations of the figures and events that have shaped our nation. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to your engagement. A historia foi estructurada en cinco capítulos completos, cada explorando diferentes aspectos de vida de Frank Lucas. Desde sua infancia, na pobreza rural su legado após a morte. Cada capítulo inclui análise profunda e contextualização histórica, com cinco camadas para aqueo estrategicamente posicionadas, inscrição, like e-comentario, distribuídas ao longo do texto em inglês, conforme solicitado.